Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandra. I'm the editor of Denfair. And welcome to our speaker series, which is a program curated by me and proudly presented by this year's major speaker series sponsor, Clipsal by Schneider Electric. Now, I don't know about you, but I have just very quickly wolfed down my lunch in order to come back here on time. And I'm really excited about this panel. So Melbourne, as we all know, I think is pretty well known for being a foodie hub. And today we have Cassie Hansen from Artichoke moderating a talk on Australian hospitality design with Iva from If Architecture, Stuart from Luchetti Krelle, and Mark from DesignOffice. So let's welcome them all onto our little panel.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us here at this very busy fair and a very busy time of the year. We're very grateful for you all to take some time out of your schedules to join us here. So, in this amazing space also. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cassie Hansen and I'm the editor of Artichoke magazine. I am so thrilled and excited about today's topic, which is we'll be delving into hospitality design. It's one of my favourite one of my favourite types of projects to publish in the magazine. Probably shouldn't say that, but it is. And when they told me who would be on the panel for this session, I just thought, oh, great. Got three of the best hospitality designers in the country here, and they happen to be just the loveliest people. So I am so delighted that they could join us for this. Today, over the next hour, we'll be looking at hospitality design, particularly at where we've come from and where we're at currently. We'll also be looking and thinking about the attitudes and expectations and how they've evolved from both the patrons and the client. We'll be looking at that dirty word trends and Instagram. And also we might start a bit of good old-fashioned Melbourne versus Sydney rivalry. We've got a token Sydney cider. We've decided to include one today. This is Stuart here.
I don't speak on behalf of Sydney ciders at all.
No, everything's on the record today. Now, usually with these types of things, I would read out a bit of a bio, but I thought I would just quickly introduce these guys and we'll delve straight into it. So on our panel, we have Stuart Krelle. Stuart, alongside Rachel Luchetti, are the directors and the founders of Sydney-based Luchetti Krelle, and they've designed pretty much every second restaurant, cafe, bar in Sydney. Iva Foschia, who is founder and director of If Architecture. One of my really good friends, actually. And has designed, she's just finished the Prince Dining Room in St Kilda. She's done Marion in Collingwood and the next door Cutler & Co., both Andrew McConnell ventures, and a few wine cellars and all that sort of good stuff. A few other little restaurants dotted around Melbourne. And finally, Mark Simpson, who with Damien Mulverhill are the co-directors of DesignOffice, a Melbourne firm. And they are very prolific. They did the amazing Higher Ground fit-out, which is become a kind of an iconic Melbourne space in a very short amount of time, and also a lot of different projects across the country and around the world actually. So I think I'd like to start the conversation with asking each of our panellists what the very first hospitality project they worked on was, and the most recent one. And then we'll delve into what they've seen change over those years. So, Stuart, what was the very first hospitality project you worked on?
I think there were a couple. I'll use two as an example because we had a restaurant that was Saki, which is now they've done one in Melbourne, but at the time this was in 2008, and that was our first kind of large-scale restaurant space. And that was 500 square metres. And I think at the time, why I want to use the other example is when we had one of Sydney's first small bars, because I guess the small bar licensing laws had only just changed in Sydney at the time. So I guess from there we've seen like this huge kind of just wave of hospitality just kind of sweep through Sydney at that time. So we had that large-scale restaurant, and that kind of was what set us in motion. I think with hospitality design it's quite public, so we get to I guess you get the recognition kind of that way because people get to enjoy the space a little bit more. But otherwise, the small bar was one that was kind of just interesting to see how that just kind of took on. So, yeah.
And what's the most recent one you've just completed?
Most recent one, I guess there's Long Grain Tokyo, which is a little while ago, as a restaurant space, and then otherwise we've got other little. There's actually we've done a sake in Manly, so my business partner Rachel headed that one up. But that's interesting because now that's, I think, number 6 of those. We haven't done all of them, but that's kind of a repeat.
And so what time span are we talking there from the first to the last there?
So what's that? We've been 11 years.
11 years.
So, yeah, I think the opening of the first one was in 2009. So, it's 10 years.
Okay.
So which is actually that cycle that you actually see through hospitality interiors.
Yes.
We're kind of seeing that through as well. So how things are actually either updated or
Yes.
kind of fall away to the wayside.
Which I think we'll get into a little bit later, but I'd love to discuss that more.
Sure.
Eva, first one, even without working for your own firm, but the start of your career and then the most recent.
First one was actually Vue de Monde at Norman B. Chambers.
Oh, smashing it out of the park with the first one.
But that was with Ellen Burke-Fraser. And I was a graduate, so scary, very scary. And the last one was Prince Dining Room with, obviously, If Architecture.
Two very iconic venues.
Yeah.
And a few in the middle too, which we'll get to later.
Yes, okay.
Mark?
2 probably in terms of historically, before DesignOffice, which formerly had a relationship with Universal Design Studio. We both worked in London for a while, and the first one I ever sort of worked on and designed was Canteen, which was interesting in that it was set up as a brand and as a chain. It was about developing something that was ownable and would grow. And then the first project we did as a studio was nearly 10 years ago, and it's timely because they just got back in touch about maybe doing something new. So we've been talking about it and how it's aged and how it is, but it was Two Bob Cafe in Clifton Hill. And the interesting thing in that, looking back at it now, is they were Brisbane-based, independent, small operator in Brisbane who really wanted to come to Melbourne but do something that wasn't Melbourne, which was kind of interesting in terms of in the context of Melbourne's reputation, which is so strong rightly in hospitality. But I think it was at that point where there was starting to be a bit of a proliferation of people paying a bit of, not just slightly kind of insincerely kind of taking tropes from what was great about Melbourne cafes. So they kind of said, we don't want any bare brickwork, we don't want any bare light bulbs, we don't want any black metal. It wasn't that they wanted it to feel Brisbane, because that wouldn't have worked either, but they wanted it to feel like something that they didn't think existed yet. And I think that then more recently, kind of, I think about recent projects, probably with like both High Ground, Congress in Collingwood and Kazuki's in Carlton, are all clients I think that have kind of been really good, been really game for going on a journey of doing something that they didn't need to know about something else. And I think that's been quite a nice journey to see in the last 10 years of hospitality design in Australia.
So what have you seen in those changes of those 10 years in terms of what the client is coming to you nowadays as opposed to 10 years ago, and also what the patrons are expecting from their dining experience or their drinking experience?
I don't know. I think it does feel slightly specific to hospitality design. I think in Australia, most of our clients don't want to talk about other people's spaces. We try and stay away from Pinterest anyway, but they don't kind of come with preconceived ideas. And I don't know what it is, but I think maybe because the reputation and it is about lifestyle and food and drink, Australia has a really strong reputation globally. There seems to be a confidence to do something and go with it without needing to be referential or be reassured by something that already exists. And that does feel like it's been a 10 to 15 year journey, I would say.
And why do you think that is? Is that based on the young history of Australia in terms of hospitality design, I'm speaking, the type of designers that the schools are producing, or what do you think that comes down to?
I don't know. I mean, I think the only things I can tie it down to is there's some part of it's lifestyle, I think, in terms of relaxed and confidence. I mean, when you look at other places in the world, I still don't think anywhere does high-end casual like Australia. This idea of doing something at a really high level that's not cheap, but in a really casual way that actually feels quite relaxed and is about how you feel as opposed to kind of being formal. And there's something that maybe relates to lifestyle. Maybe it's produce. I don't know. What do you think?
On the lines of what you're saying, Mark, I think there's a lot of Australians generally don't like to look too show-offy. And so they like this, even if they're going out to have a really beautiful meal at a generally quite a high price, they like that space to feel relaxed and comfortable, and that it's could be for anyone, and you could turn up in jeans. And I think that's quite a difference to European examples. Just been away recently, and the formality of places like in Europe, 100 times more formal than a similar offer here in Australia. White tablecloths, etc., etc. And here you can go to the best restaurants in the country without any tablecloths at all. Mm.
And Stuart?
Oh, no, all I was going to say is I think it's that history that we don't have. It's a really exciting kind of time to actually see, even in 10 years, how fast it's all taken on, and it's just a great energy to see, because we're not shackled to the past or having to change. I think it's really just something that's just kicking on, and the identity of things, we're just getting better, smarter and sophisticated in everything that it is, be it in service or actually and the actual approach to actual design. So yeah, that's what's really exciting about it.
I don't know if that might also be a bit of almost export reflection, because I think it's only really been 5 to 10 years. There's a lot of major Australian businesses doing seriously in the States and in Europe, and then maybe just that sort of reassurance of actually this is pretty unique, and there is a sensibility that is not that common and is pretty uniquely grounded here, and you can export that, and then reflecting it back does maybe something for risk taking. There's a bit of let's do it, which is good.
And I think the public has just had this sort of real passion and but in the last decade or so with the food boom, they take it much more seriously. They're much more interested in the produce and the level of dining that they're experiencing. And because the standard is so good, I think that expectation keeps getting raised. So that also puts a certain expectation and a pressure on you guys to create those sort of spaces that match up to those.
I think some of that is actually driven from the hospitality industry itself. So last night I was just at an event and where they congratulated their waiter who'd been there for 10 years, and our client, actually Andrew, was saying that before 10 years ago or more, being a professional hospitality person, a professional waiter, wasn't even a consideration. And now that profession is also taken very seriously, and so that has also driven then the front of house has driven the design outcomes as well, which is probably quite new for us in such a young country, whereas those traditions are embedded overseas.
So onto design now and the process itself. On a typical project, where do you begin? How does that look? Perhaps, Eva, I'd like to start with you with your most recent project, Prince Dining Room. Mm-hmm. With such a site and a venue that's so historic and nostalgic for so many Melburnians, where did you begin with that?
Well, I was fortunate with that project because I actually worked there as a student. So I actually knew the building quite well, even though the clients didn't know that when I went to meet them. So I feel like that was a bit of an advantage, actually. And I knew quite a bit of the history of the building also. But really, it was about starting back at the very beginning and understanding the building, given it's such an iconic venue in Melbourne as well. So not just understanding the bricks and mortar, but also understanding the social and sort of cultural importance of the venue, understanding where the clients would also like to take the business. The space was a sort of a well-known fine dining venue for a long time, and I think you can probably count the fine dining venues in Melbourne now on one hand. That sort of style of dining has changed a lot, and so they wanted to be able to demonstrate how much that venue has changed. So from the beginning then, really the pre-design was all about research, knowledge, understanding the operational, functional brief from the client, but then being able to present back to them our understanding of the history of the venue, the type of service that they would like to engage, and then how the sort of operational side could work with the conceptual side of the design. So originally it's a lot, at the beginning it's a lot of presenting back to them and then expanding on that once we're all sort of on the same page about what it could be, and then trying to challenge them a little bit as well.
And Mark and Stuart, you both are co-directors with your business partners. How does that process, the design process, unfold for the two of you? Mark, we might start with you.
It's kind of seamless. I suppose, the process is not dissimilar to what Eve was talking about. Damien and I think Rachel and Stuart are the same. We share the creative direction across all projects. So actually, the reason we have the studio and have the business is because that works together really well. So it's kind of just like having a sort of someone to bounce off constantly. So there's no sort of split in that sense. And I think it's come back to the similar things that Eve was saying with sort of Congress is the project that's probably a good example in terms of the things that go into that process. Is in that case, we ask a lot of questions, I think, and that's part of all of our jobs about, what I want to see a menu. I really want to know what you're serving, how you're serving it, who's the customer, what do they want to feel like, what are you trying to create, and it's the kind of only exception to Pinterest I'll have is if people can show images of emotion as opposed to space. I quite like that. If there's a sense of I want that feeling in this image where the light is coming through here and this person just looks really low, or they look really grounded, or they look like they're not. They look like they're in a rush, or kind of designing for speed. That sort of stuff is part of, I think, the unlocking. But then the other thing is the site. And with Congress, the interesting thing with that is that it was a new development for a developer who owned the building and all the apartments, and we were basically trying to design a venue that was almost the living room for the residents. And I think so what the site does, what the building does, is always going to influence it, but it goes hand in hand with what the creative aims of each client is. And that kind of, in art, for me, that takes it often away from aesthetics. The tagline we settled on with Congress was consciously unfashionable. They just like this idea that it would still be kind of there in a very Melbourne way in 20 years and have kind of aged and layered a bit, but actually it would still be there. And it's not about having a fit out, it's about kind of wearing, in a sense.
Stuart, Rachel?
No, I think the only thing I'd add differently to that is clients have access to Pinterest anyway. So even the actual recycling of images and those algorithms that kind of present, sometimes it's feeding through. So I think now it's even trying to, certainly coming from a period where we didn't have that stuff, is that the idea of trying to let the staff know about the ideas of trying to think of different media and other ways to kind of do it, because it is, I think hospitality is emotive, and that's all you're trying to get. So and that's why I think when you're trying to get a solid brief out of a client, is trying to understand what you actually want the actual patron to actually feel and experience, and that's what the person's going to take. They're going to remember maybe small details, but generally it's the actual feeling and experience they receive. And the only other difference would be between Damien and Mark and Rachel and myself would be, I think, just as our business has grown, is that we're struggling with the idea of not designing by silos, but Rachel and I are a bit more pulled apart at the moment, and we're trying to bring that back, because the strength is when we started out, that's where it was. Yeah. So we've been on a bit of a kind of journey, and we always check in and things, but I think trying to find creative time that's actually just the two of us is something that we're actually working on. So.
You touched, Mark and Stuart just touched on that. Then my next question, I'm hearing more and more clients, and I guess patrons are wanting to go into a space and capture that Instagram moment. And I think there's problems with that, but also I understand that it's part of a wider marketing strategy for many of these operators. How do you reconcile that sort of thinking and your design thinking, where you don't want another sort of trend-based space? And do you take much notice of trends? And how do you? What's your love-hate relationships with that sort of thing?
I think I've shifted probably my perception of it a little bit. I remember a few years ago, it was a definite eye roll in terms of Instagram, and I think, but having seen, definitely, Handpicked Wines who are setting up a brand, and actually they want that to be big, and they want it to be big through Australia and Asia, and it definitely works. Then actually working with Nathan at Higher Ground, their Instagram fodder is kind of amazing, and it self-fulfills, and it does work. So I think the idea of designing a space which has moments that are memorable as opposed to a specific thing, I would probably feel more comfortable with, but it does exist. And I'm not very good with trends. I don't know, I feel a bit unfashionable, which is okay with me, but I don't.
It seems to be working for you, Mark.
I don't know. It's kind of, I think it's just being aware of what interests you and what spaces make you feel good. For me.
Anyone else want to comment on that one?
Yeah. I guess all I was going to say is also food is fashion and hospitality is fashion. So it's trend-like in itself. I think the request for Instagram moments has lessened in the last. Well, I think food retail it's where it's stronger, but I think as a hospitality experience, again, like I said, that's the emotion they're trying to do, and then I think the imagery that you see on that is usually zoomed in anyway, so I don't think it's about the space anymore, and having that kind of, I need to be photographed within that, and the operators are just so savvy, like it's, if you've seen our Instagram, it's completely shit. So we're hopeless at that kind of thing, so we can't comment too much on that. So I think that's why, I think that the operators now they know that's their marketing tool, and they're just so savvy at it.
Eva, at the level that you're working at with clients like Andrew McConnell and Prince Dining Room, is that part of their brief at all?
No, it hasn't been.
That doesn't surprise me.
And in fact, like the one venue that we've worked on that I think has the most Instagram attention is Attica, but it's not for the fit out, that's for sure. Like it's by far and away for the food. So I remember checking the hashtag after it opened and saying to my partner, "Oh, no one's taking any pictures of the venue," like because it was all about the food, which actually then is reality check. Like we design spaces that are there to fundamentally support the food and bev offer. Well, that's how I see it. That the design is subservient to that. It's part of a whole, but it's not the hero. The hero is Ben's food, and that's why people are going to a venue like that. They might have saved up all year to be able to go, and so I want, obviously, everyone to feel welcome in those spaces, but that the design and the fit out is not there to overpower the end offer. So in terms of those clients, it hasn't really come up yet. Who's to say that it won't?
A lot of the I think it's a more discerning customer as well. There's always the danger with a lot of those things when people can kind of tell if you've sort of designed it as a thing.
I think you've got a problem when the design is better than the food. Yeah, it's like, well, why are we really here?
But if there's a moment you're trying to create for somebody to take a photo of to hashtag, and there is exceptions to that, I think, but generally I think people can kind of tell, and then it's not part of that whole thing about feeling relaxed, and a lot of hospitality is about relaxed or feeling great or kind of escape. It sort of feels a bit forced.
And it's that lasting power, and that small bar I was mentioning earlier on, what was really interesting about that was the guys did no marketing on that, and this is back in 2008. They didn't want to put it to food press because they wanted to inject themselves into the local community and just have a constant. They didn't want to spike, as if anyone's from Sydney, you know that it's kind of, Sydney loves everything nice and new and flash. So they didn't promote it at all and just kind of let it kind of a low simmer, and that's what's quite nice as well. So, and I think that's why the Instagram moment, all those things, it's fleeting now, and it's too costly for someone to actually kind of build a whole site around something that's only going to last 6 months.
So I'm interested now to sort of look at the differences, if there are any, and maybe the parallels between the Melbourne hospitality design aesthetic and the Sydney. And also, I guess I'm really interested to hear from Stuart about also what the lockout laws have done, challenges and opportunities around that. So how would you define Sydney versus Melbourne as the Sydney sider on this panel? What do you notice about Melbourne and what do you notice about Sydney?
But I think what the greatest thing about Melbourne is, actually, firstly I should start from the point that I think it's great to have two cities that are different. I think there's always this talk of one's better than the other, and it's like, don't really want Sydney becoming Melbourne, because then why would we leave Sydney to come to Melbourne? It's great to come here, but the idea that Melbourne has always appreciated the arts and design, and they've got that background. I think there's the great appreciation for those things. Sydney's a developer city. I think it's very much quick buck, and then I think the appreciation isn't as great. And certainly Melbourne has a sophistication. I think the service industry has just been, it's a lot sharper than in Sydney, has been for a long time. So that's probably the big difference. Everyone always comes back from Sydney, or after they've had a weekend in Melbourne, they're like, everyone in Melbourne's just so friendly. And you're like, you're on holidays. Of course, everyone's friendly. But no, it generally is that the level is fabulous of service. I think that's the difference.
And what did you find with the Sydney lockout laws, how that changed the scene?
Yeah, Sydney, I think, is taking on the casual really strongly and in a good bar scene. The lockout laws, it's the biggest effect I think it has had is the general outlook. So everyone is a bit down the dumps now. It's been going on for too long. There was Jaime Hayon came out, and I was lucky enough to be at a dinner with him and going out with a Spaniard and then saying, "Oh, sorry, we're closed." So he's like, "I'm hungry now." So that was a shame, but that was in the early years. But like I think anywhere in the world you'll find is the creative element in people is that they'll kick on. So now there's it's like old style raves and things like that are actually popping up in like the industrial south of the city and things like that. And it sounds unreal, like how things are sprawling around, and people just find new avenues to actually come apart. So I think the time of things isn't great. It's generally, you're in bed by 12, but yeah, no, but
you got kids, Stuart, that's good.
Yeah, that's me. But yeah, I think the creative element of it is that it is actually you're seeing other little interesting bars and things pop up around. So
it's got to be about the weather as well, right? Like generally Sydney has nicer weather.
Yeah.
And so there's opportunities.
That's very generous.
Yeah. So it's got to be, different weather opportunities present themselves differently. Like I remember with Marion, I had really big ideas about opening up the whole shop front. And I don't know, I hadn't really thought it through. I just thought it was a good idea. And the client said, we'll put all this money in doing that, and you'll never be able to. You'll open the windows, 10 times a year, and the tram goes, down the road, and it's dusty, and So I think, like generally in Sydney, even probably last weekend,
we close windows for 10 days a year.
Yes, and so the way you can design around that is then a completely different way. When everyone has a possibility of looking more outwards, then I think we have to look inwards and create, the sort of atmosphere within the space when you're looking inside, as opposed to looking outside at a beautiful view on a beautiful day and things like that.
But it's interesting is how much is limited in Sydney, because Christmas time comes and you just love the idea of something with a view, and then you kind of think there is a limit to what has that view. But years ago you guys have had rooftop bars for years, but the actual uptake on Sydney rooftop bars is so slow, and you think for something, and I only put it down to like red tape. Like Sydney's is highly bureaucratic, so that's the only thing I can put it down to. But I find that Melbourne, how cold it can be, and you got blankets and everything, and everyone's still sitting outside. And like in Sydney,
just a little crazy.
Our winter, everyone's like, oh, let's go home. So, yeah.
Mark, you've done projects in both Sydney and Melbourne. What has been your experience?
I don't know. I don't know if it's a little bit. It might be playing just to the Gemini in me. We kind of work consciously, but probably about as much work in Sydney as Melbourne, and that's kind of deliberate. Really like working in Sydney, and it does feel like a much more removed city than it is geographically. Like the distance isn't as big as it feels, I think, emotionally, which I really like about it. Definitely weather. There's definitely a huge thing. I mean, Marta's a good example. It was a relatively low budget sort of refresh of a space, but it was all about, literally we took the shop front off and made the new thing the interface between inside and out. And just by doing that you totally couldn't do in Melbourne, the space feels completely different. And the way that, it's another one I quite like on Langkelly Place, which has gone now, Wilbur's, and they would kind of serve you from the other side. They'd go outside and you'd be sitting out the bar in the window. That sort of dialogue of designing with the inside and the outside is a really big difference. There's probably is a little bit more polish generally, I think it's probably fair to say. The only thing...
Stuart's nodding.
Politely.
Yeah, I don't know. I really like designing there. I think the only thing I don't quite understand, and I think there is truth in it, is there does still seem to be, as Stuart said at the beginning, there is a different speed of design relevance. And I kind of like the fact that in Melbourne there is, your Beccos and Il Boccaros and even like long grains and things that kind of haven't changed. And there's been some seriously expensive fit-outs in Sydney that have been amazing with great food, and they kind of go when they're replaced as opposed to evolving.
I agree. This is even going back to even 2008, is that Melbourne's had institutions for going back a long time, and Sydney, it's, the Eat, Drink, Design Awards, and when they do the what's the institution, see what's lasted the longest, and it's just like the first 4 years were just Melbourne, and it is, Sydney's actually really hard to find something that's actually lasted longer than 10 years, and untouched, which is amazing about Melbourne as well, is that people, and that's I think where that comes back to that respect of what went into it and the design, and I think that approach has also helps with how people respect the space.
Do you think it's changing though, in terms of is Sydney getting a bit more embracing the institution?
I would say yeah, but except in this last week, we've just had like 3 kind of big names, just kind of, not that the interiors or anything, but they've now decided to close, and maybe even 4, and that's changed, and I can understand how as chefs and operators they wanted like a new take on things, which is great, but that's kind of suddenly where you're kind of getting into that realm of we've got double digits or something is now gone. So. But yeah, I think generally it's changing as people, I think that's where, even as hospitality spreads into the suburbs, the idea of people actually want something that's an extension of their home is actually why the institutions are kind of keeping on, so that the age of something stays.
Mark and Stuart have both completed projects overseas. I'm interested to hear what you all think about how Australian hospitality design is regarded overseas, and also you being Australian was part of you getting those jobs? Is it what they come to look... I guess they're looking to Australia for all the very risk-taking and the daring things we're producing. And, I think it's pretty evident over the last few years that Australian hospitality projects have won overseas awards, and there are more and more designers from here heading overseas to do projects, because I think that's kind of perhaps sought after now. Is that what you sort of... how was your experience with working in Japan, and how did that come about?
It came about more from the operator, so the Japanese clients transit group, and they've taken things like Bill's Cafe over there, when they've now made the 8th in Japan, but also Guzman and Gomez even. They've got a whole bunch of different ones, and Longrain was one as well, and they had the Apollo there. So Sam Christie, our Australian client, was what was brought, and then he put it to Australian designers to see who would come up. So that's how we kind of got that job. But after that, we're now working directly with Transit on another project in Tokyo as well. So I think they liked the way we worked. There was a local architect there that would assist, and of course language is the big thing, so that's how it works. But the great thing is about drafting, of course, it's a universal language, so you can kind of really just need translation on things, but and they're very exact, so it was a lovely system. But then we've also got a project now in China, and they found us on Pinterest. So they were like, how'd you find us? And they said, we just saw your name a couple of times. So they've got a Spanish designer and some other designers in a Jean Nouvel hotel, and then they've just kind of, I think, buying designers almost from different parts. So that's another kind of a strange approach, because you think, no, working there it's actually been really easy, and also the time difference, all those things has made for a really easy way. I don't think it's as difficult as, but it was just really the opportunity was provided by a client. I can't say it's easy enough to just kind of walk in there and go, we'll take that one. So. Yeah.
Mark, you've worked in London and then Australia, and you've done projects in Beijing? Shanghai,
yeah.
Sorry. And there's another international project you did, is there? Nope.
Not in hospitality. I mean, it's been Little Beans probably...
Little Beans, yes, that's right.
Is China.
Yep.
And I think the experience there was slightly less professional introduction than yours, Stuart, in that and it's probably the power of social media again. We did a project that was with Andrew Kelly, who was Auction Rooms, temporary pop-up coffee, therefore generated coffee blog world, which is quite powerful. They just sent us an email out of the blue, and us not being always hugely professional, like, someone from China just emailed. So we basically I had a friend from uni, they were like, why don't we just go meet them? And
Take on a holiday to it.
Yeah, and it was, as we found out during the process, the whole part of them coming to us and what they wanted to do was to make sure it was Australian, and they kind of interrogated us a bit through it actually. It was a really weird site. There was a radial building, and so the design solution has lots of circles in it, and they went on, in their mind, circles are Chinese. We had to go through this whole justification of use of circles, thank you, Seidler and Kennedy Nolan, in Australian design to say that it's like circles aren't Chinese. They're kind of, it's okay. And it was a good process. I mean, it helped. We found a local partner, which makes a big difference to work with. So they did all the documentation. The big things are just kind of, its finishes was the big thing. So literally in the end, I took several suitcases over and we ended up just saying, can you match this and we'll come back. And that was much easier than trying to specify anything. It's like, we want concrete that looks like this, which is not the easiest thing to travel with, or most sensible thing to travel with. And that quality, once they had something to match, they could match it really well. And the quality of build was good. And I think the only thing we didn't foresee there, which is, I think still there is a difference between Australia and Asia in terms of coffee culture, is we would design for mornings, they design for evenings. Like we went to shoot it at I went to do a recce the night before we shot it at 6 p.m. thinking, great, it'll be empty, and it was pumping. And then we shot from 8 a.m. till midday. It was no one there. So it's kind of, that is a definite difference in terms of what you design for in a cafe that I think we didn't really know about.
You've all had repeat clients. Stuart, you've done sake and you've done...
Yeah, we've done something with a group called Applejack, so the butler and
you were just saying
Bob
transit
and
as
Tone,
well.
so and then Single Origin Coffee as well.
Yeah, and Eva, you've worked with Andrew McConnell twice now for Marion and Cutler & Co.
Yeah, we did a little thing for Cumulus Up, and then that's actually working with Andrew on his residential place as well.
And Mark, you've done hand-picked wines a couple of times, and that's it. Is that it?
Palace, quite a few.
Oh, yeah, Palace.
Palace Cinemas.
Cinemas,
and then a
it's
few
fantastic.
different operators we're sort of talking about next things at the moment with. So it's kind of, yes.
So how do you
All Sydney stuff.
Yeah. How do you evolve that relationship? How does it naturally evolve, and how do you how does that brief change from the first project to the second project and so on? Eva?
I think it gets better.
Yes?
Yeah.
Because you start to understand each other and you start to understand how each other works?
Yeah, it's a relationship. So, in the first project, you're getting to know each other, trying to figure out each other's shorthand and understand the way that they like to run their business and the way, from the front of house to the back of house. And so I think the nerves or sort of insecurity in the first project of, trying to get it right and everything like that, a lot of that dissipates by the second and third project. Obviously you want to keep your ideas fresh and whatnot, but then things operationally, especially, you don't need to even speak of them really, because you sort of understand it's not you trying to interpret their needs. You can just show them, demonstrate it. So
The trust is established.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Does that equate to better projects each time?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. I think, like anything, working a relationship is something you need to work on, and so the outcome then for each design process is a culmination of the strength in the relationship.
I think being able to also, I think at the end of the day, what we all do and what we want to is about relationships. It's really rewarding working with the same people again. But what we're sort of trying to do more of, and I think it's really important, is to go back and go, essentially it's a prototype. What didn't work? Actually, what could we do better? What should we learn from? And that, handpicked's probably, I hope they don't mind me saying that, it was an interesting one in that we're now doing their second flagship, but they had never operated anything. No venue, they were totally winemaker and online retailer. And so to go back and go, actually, they didn't know how they were going to operate. And that's the opposite of a lot of, hospitality clients who know exactly how they want to operate. But to then go on that journey and be able to go, well, that didn't work, and why didn't it work? And what do you now know about yourselves as a business? And do that again. It's actually quite a luxurious thing to do, to be able to go back and revisit something based on new information that's kind of proven.
How have you found that experience, Stuart?
I think, from a sake point of view, there's common details. So there's a little bit of not a kit of parts, but I guess you kind of know what you're kind of hoping to achieve. So there's tried and tested elements. But then there was with Applejack, there was one where it was a whole new kind of concept. But the great thing was just, I think, coming from a team aspect from the very get-go and understanding what everyone's roles were within that at an early stage, just even worked even better the second time. So like you're saying, that relationship is working on that. But I think everyone could say that they learnt from things. It's not like, oh, these were the mistakes you made, and it wasn't kind of making that it was accountable by a certain team member. It was very much spread across the whole team. So I think that's the interesting part, to see how that kind of works. Is that that very the genesis of each project, of how you kind of create that team dynamic. Exactly.
I think to talk about hospitality design, we can't sort of ignore a major part, which is sort of part of the whole holistic experience, is the branding. And often you guys are working with graphic design teams that the client has probably brought on board, and that comes down to the logo and the menu, font choices and the uniform and all those sorts of things. How do you guys have a working relationship with the graphic design teams, and how does that process unfold?
When they come on board at the beginning, I think it determines the best results. Like, then you can be on the same page, you can conceptualize each of your mediums, you'll always have a really good, a line of communication, even if you don't always agree. But definitely my advice to any hospitality operator would be to have your design team on board together at the very, very beginning, and don't leave things till the end if you want the most holistic result.
And does that happen more often than not?
You can, yeah. Especially, not everyone has a great budget, or not everyone's a seasoned operator, and they're just learning as well, and so they're just trying to make do, and often things like the communications can be seen as smaller parts of the process, maybe because they're physically smaller, and so they undervalue how important it is. So that can happen right at the end, and I think by that stage, the communications designer is, they've inherited a design concept that's in the space, and I feel like that's a bit of a wasted opportunity. You both can get really better results from working with each other. So, yeah, I think bring it on in the beginning.
I don't know why. I mean, more often than not, and I think we're the anomaly here. We are often after graphics and communication, which is kind of weird given the general timeline of building things. But it's a big part of it in terms of that relationship, and I suppose it's probably because a lot of those people are more than, it's not graphics design, it's brand and strategy. It's in terms of actually somebody going, like even Kazuki's with Studio Round, it's like them going, okay, we're going to move from Daylesford to Melbourne, we're going to move high end there and make Daylesford more casual. How do we do this strategically as much as the graphic design thing? And then so we came into the mix as part of strategy, and the same with hand-picked wines with Right Angle and Congress with Hi-Ho. They were kind of bigger gestations as opposed to graphic design. And so I think having the other good thing I find is it can be a real ally to you creatively. If there's actually somebody in a different creative discipline that's kind of all going in the same direction but backing up what you're doing, and vice versa, and just more opinions when they're, if there's, it can make a good, healthy conversation.
Very diplomatic of you, Mark. Final few questions before we might turn it over to the audience. What do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities for both the hospitality industry and designers over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Thanks.
What would you like to see change or stay the same, I guess?
I think there is an awareness. There's obviously an increased awareness, I think, generally in society about sustainability, and it's something in terms of, our role in our industry is actually quite difficult. I think when you couple that with, and the reality is, and I know there's a lot of people who are very successful and do it really well, hospitality is a tough industry. Yep. It's actually, I don't think it's that easy
very
to
low
make
margins,
work. The margins are really low, and you've got to really nail the formula. So I think, and that's, I do particularly like working with owner-operators, because every dollar really counts, and they're really caring about it. So I think doing that in a way that actually there's a longer life, and there's a sense of something can evolve is, I think, going to start happening more. I mean, it's many years ago now. My first ever job was at DGW in London, and Frank Duffy was kind of talked about workplace strategies, spaces having layers, and I've always quite liked that idea that there's kind of, he talked about stage and scenery and props and actors, and this idea that actually, if you're taking on a lease and committing to an investment, you can evolve, and that can maybe change, and that idea that actually getting the bones right, the business might shift because the market might shift, and trying to look at things less about, create something, strip it out, change it, but actually getting bones that can be worked with, and that has a longer life, and therefore that helps sustainability, both ecologically and financially. That's starting to happen more, I think, as a conversation.
Eva?
Yeah, well, I guess we've been through a period of really good economic growth, and I think probably the challenges could be going forward is that also the market is very saturated, and there's no sort of stopping, it seems, to new venues sort of popping up all the time, which can be really good for the designers, but also you want that to coincide with a sustainable venue in terms of its lifespan. So I think that culturally we've changed a lot, obviously, so we all go out to eat more. That's become part of our culture, so there's probably a good foundation for that now going forward. But I do think that, sort of what comes up must kind of come down, and so I'm a bit cautious about then and what Mark was hinging on as well, even for some of our clients that seemingly, have multiple venues, that conversation about margins, about all sorts of things, that is something that's always front of mind. So if they're concerned about that, it means that that's a concern across the whole industry. So I think that as designers, we have to be careful even about what we're associated, who we're associated with, and trying to make that lovely marriage between a really good client, a really good project, and our work, because obviously you want that work to live. You don't want that work to close down. Like, that can be a real challenge for us if you're constantly working on venues that are then closing down all the time. That's not great either.
I think that's like really good points in there. And lastly, the only thing from maybe a Sydney perspective, I'm not sure how it is for Melbourne, but there is the multi-venue aspect and operators in Sydney, and I just think what might be the challenge over time is, of course, there's the external stuff of the economy, and I think that margins are always, that's always been restaurants, but the fact that you've got these multi-venue operators and just kind of squeezing, because I think you can even see it in food retail. So the idea of what was it, your mums and dads operators in food courts has been squeezed out for the idea that people want to have brands that they've trusted. So I think that's happened in food retail, and then when it comes to restaurants, is that it's great. These guys these operators are so creative, and they've got new venues, but at the same time they are just taking up more real estate. I think closer to, say, the city or something. So I think 5 to 15 years would be interesting to see how it is for the person that's just trying to start something, and how hard that might actually be difficult. How difficult that will be for them. Yeah.
Okay, speed round before we go to audience questions. To each of the panelists, favourite Australian restaurant design and favourite international one. I'll go, Eva.
Oh, all right. I just went to Neptune in London, and that was amazing. That was really, really cool. I really enjoyed that. Bones of the building were incredible, but fit out was wild as well.
Did it?
Now you put me on the spot.
We'll get back to you.
Yeah, it was really cool. And the branding was amazing, incredible.
So we're all going to get onto their website later and check it out.
Carl and Craig actually did the graphic design and the design. I'll have to get back to you. That was really good. In Australia, well, they're probably just places that I like to go and that I go to.
I was going to say that I designed.
No. Just places that I like to go repeatedly, Like, obviously, our office isn't too far from Marion, so that's a bit of a...
And that's where every Melbourne architect hangs out anyway.
So... And things like the City Wine Shop, and I love that's been around for a long time, and I think it's the people, the people that work there have been there for a really long time as well, and you feel like you get to know them, and that's... So I probably like some
the whole
of the...
experience.
The whole... Yeah, maybe some bit old school kind of Melbourne
nice
venues.
Mark?
Annoyingly similar in terms of Melbourne. I think a lot of the places I really like are almost undesigned. It's is the Napier Quarters, City Wine Shops, and that kind of... They are designed because they feel good. The acoustics are great, the lighting are great, the offer's good. It's just not very obvious design. And then I think then there is something I still really like. I think it's part of a chain, but I think Bill's in Bondi is still really great. It actually is just, it's really designed to make you feel comfortable. It suits its situation, it suits the context, it suits the brand, and you feel good there.
Yep.
So, and then internationally, been in New Zealand a lot lately, and I think Amano's really good. Just the way you experience it at any time of day, from breakfast till midnight, you can kind of find your spot on the way you want to be, and that is really smart. And then Higashiyama in Tokyo is the one I really like, because it's got a journey. You kind of go through the street, and it's emotional, as opposed to, there's not a big design in. I think the spaces, I was trying to think which spaces I've been back to more than once or twice, and it's kind of those, I suppose.
Stuart?
I've had the longest time to think, and I'm scratching my head. I'm so sorry. But I, as an experience of like the latest one I've had was in Hong Kong, and it was The Old Man. It's a bar, and the cocktails, like on my mind.
Clouded judgment there, Stuart?
Comes back to booze. But no, I think like it's just, it was fabulous. And the idea that the guy's making the cocktails for the room and everyone's kind of sitting around, and he's actually joining in the conversation, but not in that overt way. But it was fabulous. It was incredible. But yeah.
We have some time for some quick questions from the audience. If anyone would like to put their hand up for all of the panellists or one of the panellists. Oh, we have a shy audience. Go for it, Patrick.
How is the, rise of a lot of food delivery partners affecting food retail? So my question was, how is the rise of a lot of these food delivery companies, such as Deliveroo or Uber Eats, affected food retail in general? And are companies trying to use architecture to embrace that, or is it something that's not really on the mind of clients at this stage?
That's a really good question. I live in an area where there's lots of restaurants, so all I can hear is the buzzing of Vespers going by, and they're always flying around. I don't know about the fit out, like where that's affecting that, but talking to operators, and you see them where they've got their bags, and then you say, oh wow, and then just the margin that Deliveroo's taking or whatever, it's just another thing, I guess, like that. Maybe that's a great point, or that 5 to 10 year thing, is that they're just getting absolutely squeezed there, and it's absolutely awful. So some of them have to do it because it's the only way they're going to get food out, and it helps with their brand. But yeah, I think the margin's just awful how it gets squashed.
Well, I don't know too much, but I think just off Chapel Street in Paran, there's like Hawker Hall, and there's Biggie Smalls, and a few of those operators that they're all, or are looking to have a combined pickup area at the rear, so that the drivers can come to the rear, because one of the things obviously that you find is that the drivers are all hanging out the front, and so I guess a design solution to that is trying to combine forces and have a combined pickup area that the delivery drivers can get deliveries from the rear, because I think also I sort of took it as perhaps there's a slight, perhaps thinking that's a devaluing of their brand as well, when you've got so many delivery drivers out the front, and it kind of lessens the experience, I guess, for people waiting and wanting to come in. So I'm not sure if that's been executed, or what. That's just sort of what I heard on the grapevine.
There's also, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but they're talking of ghost kitchens, and I don't know if anyone knows that. So which is another awful thing. So not even just pick up, is the idea that they're just making the food somewhere else in these kitchens. So you basically give the recipe, and it comes from a singular kitchen somewhere and delivered. So so it's another kind of awful thing that's kind of happening. I think Attica would look really good with brown paper bags, though.
Any other questions from the audience before we wrap up? No, yes. One over here.
How do you go about selecting your furniture? Shameless plug.
She says with a vested interest. It's always a long process. There's several factors that come into it, and there's definitely budget's definitely one of them. I mean, I think for us it starts with personality. When we present concept, we'll generally present what we think is the right personality of furniture, which will become about design language and material and type. So for example, is that a low dining seat? Is it a 400 dining seat? Is it a countertop bar, a high bar, back, no back? So it's kind of typology in terms of what it physically does, and then design aesthetic in terms of what it communicates, because it's a really big way of reinforcing brand, then it generally comes down to comfort and budget. Like, we'll typically there's always the conversation that I expect of sort of trying to raise a lot of clients' expectation from $300 upwards to get
From
a piece
Bentwood
that they'll
chairs
love.
to something else.
Yep, to something that's kind of value still. And then we'll typically get it down to maybe 3 for a comfort test in the studio at sign-off point. I mean, and the other thing that's, we'd all know is that because of lead times on lots of things, I mean, even locally made is still talking a lead time where the decision has to be made before someone started on site. So actually committing to that and actually understanding the value in it. And it's, when I walk past Long Grain most days, and I kind of was thinking, those chairs have been there for 12 years, and great. That's actually, that was an expensive chair and it was invested in, so, but it's also a lot of money for an operator, so you've got to get the right thing for the right situation, I'd say.
I think that's probably all the time we have left today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for sticking around. Please put your hands together for our 3 amazing panellists. Mark Simpson from DesignOffice, Iva Foschia from If Architecture, and Stuart Krelle from Luchetti Krelle. We better head off now.
And thank you to Cassie Hansen from Artichoke. Thank you so much, guys, for being involved.